Anatomy 564, the Nervous System, Chapter 9. With the nervous system, we are looking at a couple different primary functions here. The nervous system includes, as its functions, it stimulates all movement. It receives all sensory input. It has to store and integrate information, and ultimately its final job is to maintain homeostasis. And I'm going to switch to a full slideshow here. All right, so receive sensory input, store and integrate information, and maintain homeostasis. Here we're looking at the two main divisions. Notice that we have two colors there. The kind of brown tan color represents the central nervous system. The central nervous system includes the spinal cord and the brain. The idea is that it's the command center, the sensory integration center. So everything, those green areas, are the peripheral nervous system. And notice that the peripheral nervous system comes into the central nervous system through the occipital lobes, where we find the autonomic nervous system, and also into the main part of the spinal cord, which finally integrates into the brain. So the central nervous system is the command center, where it receives the sensory and the integration information. And the PNS, the peripheral nervous system, is all nerves that communicate with the spinal cord, and finally the cranium itself. So for this particular video, I'm going to focus on the nerves themselves and what their job is, and then I'll do a second presentation which will include the brain. So here's a nice setup I really like, is it shows the central nervous system, and if you look to the left over here, so we have the central nervous system, which is identified as the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system on this side, which is the cranial and spinal nerves. Now the peripheral nervous system is then split into the afferent, which is the sensory nerves. So in other words, it's bringing information in. And then we have the efferent neurons, which send information back. All right, the somatic part of that efferent system is the voluntary part. In other words, the skeletal muscles. We have to physically do something or mentally do something to make that react to some kind of input. The autonomic nervous system, the ANS, also part of the efferent nervous system, includes the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system. So the sympathetic system is what we think of with fight or flight, is we're responding to some type of internal change. The parasympathetic system is the system that allows us to sleep, allows us to digest foods. It ultimately controls cardiac muscles, the smooth muscles, and all the glands. Just a different way of looking at that same slide. So within the nervous system, we have a couple different types of neurons. Neurons actually do the job of carrying impulses. Remember, we talked about neurons earlier in the year, that neurons will continue to go through mitotic division until maturity is reached. Once maturity is reached, which is about age 25, then those nerves no longer are able to go through mitotic division. Of those neurons, there's a separate division, which are called Neuroglial Cells. They are kind of the support system for the neurons. The neurons are these very long cells. The Neuroglial Cells are very small cells that have they don't carry impulses, but they're there to support the neurons. And the Neuroglial Cells can go through mitotic division throughout a lifetime. And often what we find is when we see cancers develop within the brain, within the nervous system, it usually is these neuroglial cells and not the neurons themselves. So if we look at a diagram here, if you look at that very large body in the middle, there's the neuron cell body with the axons and the dendrites extending from it. And what we see is these little cells around it are the neuroglial cells. So they're the support system for that very large neuron and the very difficult job it has to do. We have different types of neuroglial cells. All right. The neuroglial cells, first of all, are the most abundant in the central nervous system. And the 5 major types are, first of all, the microglia. They're primarily there for protection. They're the phagocytes, in other words, kind of act like the white blood cell. The oligodendrocytes, which form the myelin, which is a protective covering around the central nervous system. The astrocytes, which provide support and connect the neurons, the blood supply. The epidermal cells, which line cavities of the brain, the spinal cord. All right, and finally, the Schwann cells, which actually end up forming the myelin in the peripheral nervous system. And that myelin sheath is a protective covering for that central nervous system. So we're really going to focus on number 2 and number 5, the oligodendrocytes and the Schwann cells. So looking at this, there we have, here's the neuron. Look like the big eyes looking at you. All right. Then what we see is these oligodendrocytes actually start to form. This is the myelin sheath, all right, that surrounds, notice the axon of the neuron itself. All right, there's the astrocytes and things like that. We have microglia over here. All right, so there's the oligodendrocytes. They are helping to form the myelin sheath. Then we have the neuron itself. There's the nucleus of the neuron, the dendrites, which are short. There's the cell body, and then the axon, which are very long. And remember, we talked about the synaptic cleft and how they stimulate muscle movement. So we know that the neurons are very large. They have a high metabolic rate until they reach maturity. And these neurons hang around for a long time, usually the whole lifetime of an individual. All right, and those Schwann cells actually make up the, we talked about the oligodendrocytes that actually build the myelin sheath, and the Schwann cells actually form that myelin sheath. So here we have the neuron, the nucleus of the neuron, these short extensions being the dendrites up here, the longer one, the axons. Then, as we look at this tail around the axon, there we have the axon terminals. We have these little Schwann cells, which are actually part of the neuron. Notice that there's gaps between each of these myelin sheath particles, particulate. And in between that are what we call the node of Ranvier. Node of Ranvier's, that signal has to pass over that node of Ranvier. All right, so there's the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath contains the Schwann cell, and in between each segment of the myelin sheath, protecting that axon, we have the node of Ranvier's. So that's your basic cell anatomy for the neuron. Understand that impulses move one way. They're either going into the central nervous system, into the spinal cord and the brain, or they're moving away and sending a signal back. So the dendrites pick up information, move it to the cell body, and then the axon continues to carry it away. We've got a couple different types of neurons, and those different neurons have different structure. So if we talk about the bipolar, notice that there are 2 poles, all right, on either end. The bipolar, there's the main neuron, extends both ways. They're usually found just in the eye, in the retina of the eye, so they have a very specific job. The unipolar, all right, are part of the peripheral nervous system, and they are primarily sensory nerves. So take a look at where the dendrites are. And then we have the multipolar. And the majority of our neurons are these multipolar organisms, and they usually connect into the brain where they stimulate multiple parts of the brain at a time. All right, so there's the cell body of the neuron, the axon, and here's input coming in. There's the synapse that actually allows things to occur. So this is what we studied in this muscle reaction right here. This big block is where we have the nerve stimulating some type of action for the peripheral nervous system. All right, so there's our sensory neurons. All right, from the muscle, all right, into the spinal cord, up to the brain, and then back for a reaction. So this is what we talk about. We got to have a receptor. Then we have information into the sensory neuron. It moves to the integration center, which could be the spinal cord if it's a simple reaction, or into the brain. And then finally, the motor neuron carries that information back away and stimulates some kind of response to occur. All right, we're not going to worry with these. So, gentlemen, we're not going to worry about the neuron and its resting potential and things of that nature. We're not going to do the physiology. I really just need you to focus on the anatomy piece. And I'm going to ask you to complete worksheet number 1 in correspondence with this. So you're going to have to be able to identify the differences between the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. And so that will be study guide number 1.